Does emotional labour in service work promote gendered occupational segregation? By Alan Patel and Jake Matthews. Arlie Russell Hochschild first defined emotional labour in 1983 as the management of feeling to create a publicly observable facial and bodily display. The concept has become increasingly deliberated and is now one of the most widely discussed sociological ideas. Hochschild describes jobs requiring emotional labour as ones that require face-to-face or voice-to-voice contact, and jobs that require the worker to produce an emotional state in another person. A stark shift towards the service industry has resulted in an abundance of job roles that require emotional labour, and therefore an increased interest in the study of emotional labour. This graph highlights the increase in jobs available in the service industry in the USA between January 1939 and January 2013. In this time, there has always been more service jobs available than manufacturing jobs. Manufacturing jobs require little to no emotional labour due to their monotonous and disciplined nature. The 60s and 70s appear to be the period where service industry jobs rose dramatically. The latest figures claim that in January 2013 there were close to 120 million individuals employed in the service industry in the USA. Because the emphasis in the service industry is on customers' feelings, highlighted by the old idiom, "the customer is always right," Hochschild argues that service workers are alienated from their own feelings due to the fact that they are constantly required to express fabricated feelings in order to elicit a positive response from the customer. Journalist Rose Hackman wrote that the growth of low-wage service industry jobs, where service with a smile is an expectation, has helped further entrench the phenomenon of emotional labour. Here, emotional work is not an added value, it is rather a requirement to get workers to the bare minimum. To evaluate Hackman's thoughts, she highlights the fact that emotional labour is not paid on top of a salary, but is rather a minimum requirement in the majority of jobs nowadays, despite the toll it can take on an employee. Alternative models of emotional labour. Ashworth and Humphrey, 1993, saw emotional labour as something visible. They said that a wide range of factors influence an employee's emotional expression, and emotional labour is not necessarily an act. It is so expected now it has become second nature to employees. The focus of their study was on the relationship between the visible expression of emotion and the effect of the work. By this, they mean how much an employee allows their true feelings to be shown. Morris and Feldman, 1996, highlight three parameters an employer will expect of their employees in a service role: the frequency of the appropriate emotional display, the attentiveness to required display rules, and the variety of emotions displayed. These are an expectation of an employee due to the emphasis on the customer's emotions. This is then the cause of the emotional dissonance an employee feels. They are required to express organisationally desired emotions not genuinely felt, causing the alienation Hochschild speaks of.
Now moving on to the link between gender and emotional labour. So some of the common roles in service work that have been identified as requiring emotional labour include, but are not limited to, public administration, flight attendants, nurses, store clerks, social workers, hospitality jobs, and media positions. MacDonald and Siriani describe an emotional proletariat as service jobs in which employees are required to display friendliness and a level of obedience to customers. So, as we mentioned before, emotional labor doesn't only mean managing your own emotions, but it also involves trying to bring out certain emotions in your customers or the people you're dealing with. And so these occupations became stereotyped as female jobs because of these characteristics. Work that requires emotional labor is stereotyped as being natural for women because of the required characteristics we just mentioned. Examples are care, sympathy, and empathy. As a result, these emotional characteristics are a requirement of many occupations that are dominated by females. However, these feminized roles are not part of formal job descriptions and have instead become expected of the employee and expected of females that are commonly employed in these positions, as opposed to just part of the job description and expected of any employee of any gender working in that position. So following from that, we can look at how gender and emotional labor link in and are relevant to occupational segregation in the modern day. Due to the stigma around females and their supposed natural fit in work that requires emotional labor, many employers now seek out female employees over male ones for such roles. And because emotional labor is not part of job descriptions, it often goes uncompensated. This has resulted in females dominating fields of work that require emotional labor. Cotter et al. Present a theory regarding occupational segregation, and that is the crowding hypothesis. The authors explain that the crowding hypothesis involves emotional labor as being one of the factors that contribute to occupational segregation, and this theory suggests that as a result of women's exclusion from male-dominated occupations, namely those that don't require emotional labor, they are being segregated into a number of predominantly female-dominated occupations. Emotional labor therefore does, to a certain extent, promote gendered occupational segregation. Further on through this video, we will see some of the roles that the crowding hypothesis can be related to, where the number of females dominate the number of males substantially. These are some of the key statistics regarding emotional labor in the UK. Listed below are quite a few, so I won't go through all of them individually, but some of the ones that stood out in particular were that 97% of the childcare workforce are women, 81% of women are more likely to work in the public sector at an organization like the NHS, for example. However, with regards to the NHS, only 24% of the CEOs are women, the rest of course being men. 65% of sales and customer service staff are women. However, only 26% of women are marketing and sales managers. These statistics just go to show that emotional labor is in fact an effect and leading to occupational segregation. We can see that in the number of positions that require emotional labor, a lot of women are dominating these positions, and most of the men are in managerial positions or positions that don't require the same level of emotional labor. For example, in the last example, where 65% of sales and customer service staff are women, that's probably because in sales and customer service, there's a lot of interaction with customers, and therefore you need to maintain your emotions, manage your emotions, and also bring out certain emotions in the customers. And with marketing and sales managers, there's not as much interaction with customers, and therefore you do not have to manage your emotions as much as with sales and service staff, and therefore men are given the managerial positions, whereas women are staying as service staff and working with customers. We have seen the effects of occupational segregation across a number of jobs in various industries. In the UK, one of the biggest examples of emotional labor resulting in occupational segregation is in the case of nursing. Nursing is seen as a feminine job in the predominantly male-dominated medical industries. Most nurses are females, and most nursing managers are male. Again, this is because females are believed to be a natural fit for roles that require emotional labor versus those that do not. In this case, the role that requires emotional labor is the nursing role, and the role that doesn't is the managerial role. Porter carried out a study to gauge the perceptions and feelings of female nurses, and the results showed that female nurses believed the success of male nurses in becoming managers was down to their gender, and not down to merit or seniority. As far as job requirements go, or informal job requirements, nurses have to have higher levels of emotional labor than nursing managers, and therefore more and more women are either staying as nurses or being employed as nurses, and the males move up to managerial positions. This is an example of the crowding hypothesis, where females are being segregated into nurses and males are being segregated into nursing managers. This is arguably the most direct example of emotional labor leading to occupational segregation or promoting occupational segregation in service work.
In 1991, Sutton ran a study focusing on bill collectors entitled Maintaining Norms About Expressed Emotions, the Case of Bill Collectors. Sutton found that males were selected due to their general ability to disassociate themselves from their emotions. Their jobs require them to visit debtors and reclaim money or take personal items. This job requires the ability to ignore empathetic feelings. Sutton found that collectors are selected, socialized, and rewarded for following the general norm of conveying urgency. This therefore means that the employer is looking for the opposite reaction of the emotional labour we have looked at so far, namely a positive response from the customer. Due to the desire for an intimidated response, Sutton claimed that females would not be appropriate for the role. Ultimately, although this is a different form of emotional labour, the final effect is the same. The employee is disconnected from their own emotions, just as Hochschild found.
An interesting article that perhaps shows the reason behind some of the statistics we've previously seen is titled "I Can't Put a Smiley Face On" by Nixon. This article shows that men are becoming increasingly reluctant to engage in service work that requires emotional labor. The research he carries out is based on interviews with a number of unemployed, low-skilled men and explores their attitudes towards entry-level service work. The results show that men believe entry-level service work requires skills, dispositions, and demeanors that are antithetical to masculine working-class habitus. What this means is that this sample of men believe the skills and attitudes that are required for entry-level service work are feminine, and even if these men did possess the skills and attitudes, they would not want to exhibit them, as it would be against their masculinity. Nixon explains that emotional labor is one of the major factors that drive men away from entry-level service work, and they therefore reject forms of low-skilled service work as sources of employment. These attitudes towards emotional labor further add to the existing gender segregation and occupational segregation in certain service roles. We have seen the statistics on roles such as administrative or receptionist roles that are dominated by women, and this perhaps is an example of why they are dominated by women and why more and more men are not filling these roles. It is evident that emotional labor is leading to occupational segregation, but what is interesting is the consequences of emotional labor leading to occupational segregation, and some of these are already in action. One of the consequences is that more and more people will believe the stereotype that females are better suited to jobs that require emotional labor. Even though this is not true in all cases, if emotional labor roles are dominated by females, it will reinforce the stereotype inevitably. Consequently, men might refrain from applying for certain jobs, such as nurses or primary school teachers, because of the overwhelming statistics that show female domination in these positions, or because of their attitudes towards emotional labor, as we have seen in the previous article by Nixon. Also, women could be confined to limited jobs in certain industries. Segregation could reach a level where only are hired for jobs that require emotional labor, and more senior managerial positions are reserved for men. So if occupational segregation as a result of emotional labor would have to be reversed, here are some of the ways this could happen. Firstly, the stereotype of women being the only or the best candidates for positions that require emotional labor has to be reversed. Men and women have to be given equal opportunities for positions that require emotional labor, and those that don't, such as management ones. Current employers must alter their mindset and provide equal opportunities regardless of gender so that the next generation of employees are not segregated as a result of emotional labor. A lot of the reason that occupational segregation has occurred is because current employers do actually think that females are better suited for emotional labor roles, and this mindset has to be reversed. Employees and people seeking employment must also not be discouraged by overwhelming statistics, as we have seen before. They must also ensure that they do not fall victim to the stereotype and apply for jobs regardless of their gender and the statistics or the stereotypes of the time. Now moving on to our personal examples. Firstly, in my case, I was employed in two different organizations over a period of 2 years, and both of these were in office settings. My role involved clerical work and data entry. In terms of emotional labor and occupational segregation, in both cases, the receptionists, and all the customer service employees were women. Managers, in both cases again, were mostly men, but included some women. This supports the theory that women are commonly employed in positions that require emotional labor. However, it's important to note that this example could be purely coincidental and is not a direct example of emotional labor promoting occupational segregation, although it does show a lot of the similarities from what we've been talking about, where managerial roles are reserved for men and emotional labor roles are fulfilled by women.
I am currently employed in a major UK supermarket, where staff on tills have the most customer interaction. 90% of staff on tills are female. There is only one female manager within the store hierarchy who is the head of human resources. In my time working here, I have worked under 4 different human resource managers, all of which have been female. Therefore, the only managerial role filled by a female within the store is one that requires constant contact with employees to ensure they are happy. This is probably the role within the store that requires the most emotional labour. It is clear to see that within the store there is obvious gender segregation based on roles that require emotional labour. Question 1. How has your experience highlighted different gender expectations? Due to working in a supermarket, I've certainly found that more emotional labour is expected of women. As stated, the store looks for certain roles to be filled by women, namely the HR manager and the till staff. These roles require the most emotional labour, and the belief that women are better at this means that they are automatically selected for roles based on their gender.
My employment experience has shown that women are sought out over men for roles that require emotional labor. In my example, these being administrative roles or customer service roles that require interaction with customers in person and over the phone, and where emotional labor and management of emotions is essential. It seems as though women are expected to be better at managing their emotions than men, and therefore the men are expected to be better in managerial roles that don't require the same level of emotional labor. Men sort of have an expectation where they are more authoritative and better figures for managerial positions, and women are more in tune with their emotions and better at managing their emotions, and therefore they come with that expectation and are given the roles of customer service or administration, which require emotional labor.
Question 2. What is the impact of the emotional labour you identify on employees? In terms of my personal experience, I have witnessed numerous employees crying or exhibiting anger when off the shop floor, particularly till members and the tills manager, as they have the most emotional labour to deal with. As Hochschild says, the impact of the emotional labour is alienation from one's true feelings, and the practical effect of this is a later release of those real emotions. In many cases where emotional labour is involved, this will be frustration, due to their actual emotions being actively and constantly repressed. This is why on occasion I will see staff in the canteen away from the shop floor release their frustrations.
The final question. Do you think gendered occupational segregation is justifiable? Well, it can perhaps be argued that gendered occupational segregation is justifiable in cases where men are sought out over women for certain jobs, such as ones that require heavy lifting, for example. However, from my experience, as far as emotional labor goes, I don't think occupational segregation can be justified. It seems unreasonable to expect emotional labor from a person based solely on their gender. There are certainly men in society who can manage their emotions better than women, and they should be given equal representation in jobs that require emotional labor. We have also seen that occupational segregation can lead to gendered crowding in certain industries, and for society and cultures to be equal, there should not be any gendered occupational segregation based on emotional labor. I do not see how segregating genders into certain occupations based on stereotypes of emotional labor and of management of emotions can be justified at all. It would surely seem unfair that women are stereotyped as being better at managing their emotions and therefore sometimes stunted in their career development and segregated into certain and limited roles.
In conclusion, there is a definite trend of gendered occupational segregation when it comes to emotional labour in the service industry. The question, therefore, is not whether it exists, but whether this gender segregation can ever be overcome. The concept of emotional labour ties strongly into far larger societal issues, including sexism, that are incredibly difficult to displace. This means that the issue is as much a cultural problem as a problem within the workplace, and therefore it will not be easily challenged. Finally, here is a list of references that we used.